I'm Rebecca Lubas, if you haven't met me before, Dean of the Libraries here. And I am just going to get out of the way for our esteemed Provost, Rafiq Mohammed, to do the introductions and the why that this was a really exciting selection to feature for our fall installment. Take it away.
Why, thank you, Dean Lubas. I feel suddenly energized. I feel strange performing in front of like theater arts kind of people and stuff, and Kathy always makes me nervous anyway. So I know this. So hey, thank you all for coming out. It's good to see people in person for the first installment this year of the Provost Presents. I should know the title. Presents Faculty Research Lecture. There we go. As Rebecca just said. And to those of you in TV land, thank you for staying on your couch and not coming out and actually being here. Just kidding. We are in for a treat today. We have our featured presenter, Guillermo Aviles Rodriguez, who's an assistant professor of theater arts and joined our campus community last fall. And you came back for more.
Yeah.
Thank you. He joined us last fall, and he teaches, among other things, fundamentals of directing, dramatic literature of identity, Latinx theater, theater in the classroom, theater for youth, history and literature, acting for all majors, and he has agreed to direct my upcoming telenovela titled La Universidad, which I did actually write this telenovela, but we'll talk about that later. So he is a recognized scholar in Latinx and Chicano theater with an extensive body of publications exploring the intersection of performance, cultural history, theater education, and social justice. But wait, there's more. He earned his PhD in theater and performance studies from that other UC, the UCLA, I think it is. Yeah, it's an Irvine bias here is all I'm saying. Where he was also the Eugene V. Corta Robles Fellow. His research centers on indigenous mythology, site-specific performance, and critical historiography with a particular focus on the politics of space and cultural mobility within Latinx communities. Guillermo's publication-driven career has earned him several prestigious fellowships and accolades, including the 2021 Lowrider Studies Scholar Activist of the Year Award. His participation in the Mellon School for Theater and Performance Research at Harvard University in 2021 and 2022 underscores his status as a thought leader in the field of performance studies, with his work contributing to the broader discourse on Latinx identity, spatial politics, and performance as activism. His presentation today, titled From Nuestro Pueblo to the Watts Towers, Unearthing a Mexican Legacy, focuses on the often overlooked history behind one of California's most iconic landmarks. And I'm really interested to hear your talk today, because one of the first places I went to when I was 15 years old and came to California for a visit was my mom's like, we got to go see the Watts Towers. So I'm really interested in hearing more about what you have unearthed. So without any further ado, please welcome me in, please join me in welcoming Dr. Guillermo Aviles Rodriguez.
Thank you. Okay, so you got me on the
Oh, good.
Yeah. So first, I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here. And thank you to the Faculty Center for Excellence, the File Library, Robbie Madrigal and Dean Lubas, and of course, Provost Mohammed. And a special thank you to all the people joining us online, among whom are some of my family members. So this research has been greatly advanced through the generous support from the Office of Student Research. It was they who made it possible for Angeles Medina Morales, a young studio arts major. Can you wave to the people, please? Thank you. To assist in the research for this project. And it was she who secured some of the most compelling evidence that you will see and hear about today. So let's begin with a brief sketch of the narrative for the monument's creation. So the Watts Towers, actually named Nuestro Pueblo, were built by an illiterate immigrant named Sabato Rodia, but also called Sabatino, Sam, Simon, Samuel, and or Don Simon, depending on the source one consults. He was born in Avellino, Rome, Italy. Sometime between 1872 and 1893, Rodia immigrated to the United States between the ages of 9 and 17. The exact age is not known because, quote, there are no written records about his arrival as a youth, unquote. Mr. Rodia supposedly lands in New York or Philadelphia, then meets a woman named Lucy Ucci, his first wife. They have 3 children, and he abandons them all. And then his youngest dies of pneumonia, scarlet fever, or inanition. Rodia shacks up with an unfaithful Mexican woman named Benita. She divorces him, and then, after another escapade with an unfaithful Mexican woman, this one named Carmen or Carmelita, she leaves him for another man, taking all of Rodia's movables with her. Then one day, in 1921, he wakes up in a lot in Watts and decides that he will, quote, do something big, unquote. He works on the structure and names it the Watts Towers. And in 1954, Rodia decides to abandon his work and give it to a neighbor. The neighbor sells the property to a dairy worker who tries to open a taco stand, Towers Tacos. After an inspection of the lot, the city finds the property and the structure on it to be unsafe. And the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety issues a demolition order to put order, but it is never enforced because the city could not find the owner. Then Bill Cartwright and Nick King, a filmmaker and an actor, succeed where the city had failed and find the owner and buy the towers from him. They then apply for a permit to build a caretaker cottage. And when they do, the old demolition order is found, and they are told to demolish the whole towers. The actor and the filmmaker form a committee for Simon Rodia's Towers in Watts to defend the structure that the city calls dangerous, but that the committee calls a work of art. So then the committee reluctantly approves a stress test to test the safety of the towers, and at the end of which the towers are proved to be safe. They survive the stress test. The Watts riots and false restoration, bureaucratic incompetence, and pervasive vandalism. This is the narrative of the towers as it stands, but little of it is true. And it appears that a lot of it has been constructed specifically to erase the tower's Mexican identity. What follows, however, is not so much an investigation of how the shift away from Nuestro Pueblo's Mexican signification happened, but about how the stories, facts, and events that have been occluded because of it. The contention here is that the current history of the Watts Towers is in direct conflict with the memories and lived experiences of many Watts residents, some of whom I have interviewed for this research. My informants have provided me with tantalizing information that to this day, the physical evidence has fully corroborated. Okay, we'll fix the slides. For example, I interviewed an informant, 97-year-old, who grew up in the towers, about the fact that scholars have claimed that the towers were born in 1921. He said, oh, there he is. Yeah, we're good. So when I told him that scholars have said that the towers were built in 1921, he said, quote, that's bullshit. I was 5 or 6 years old, unquote. All this makes for a rich conflict between the institutionalized written word and the Mexican people's lived history. a history that I am trying to unearth. The Watts Towers have a long and famed history earned in part because of their geographic location. A community that earned the reputation for being a bastion of drugs and gangs and poverty. Covering just over 2 square miles, Watts has managed to become synonymous with ghetto culture and urban blight. With one of the highest concentrations of public subsidized housing units in the nation surrounding it, Watts became a battlefield for the gang wars of the 1970s and 80s. Today, the population of Watts is predominantly people of color, with 73% identifying as Latino and 25% as Black or African American. Unfortunately, residents in this area face a life expectancy that is 12 years shorter than other parts of Los Angeles, a stark reminder of the decades of neglect endured by Watts. Economic challenges are deeply entrenched as residents experience high poverty levels, a low educational attainment level, with nearly 2/3 of the population spending more than 30% of their income on housing. However, this prevailing negative narrative of Watts was not always so. Circa 1904, Watts was significant enough to warrant a visit from Teddy Roosevelt, a then sitting president. And in 1922, David Starr Jordan High School would produce Glenn T. Seaborg, the co-discoverer of plutonium. In 1936, the father of the Harlem Renaissance and Spanish-speaking poet, Langston Hughes, would visit Watts to teach a workshop in creative writing at the state-of-the-art library. Watts would also be the literary home to music legends, the likes of Johnny Otis, Charles Mingus, and adopted home to countless other musical greats and other luminaries. Today, the Watts Towers are one of the most recognizable symbols in the world and have become a totem for the predominantly Black and brown communities of Watts. In recent years, international authorities have lauded them as a monument to the human spirit and granted them a place on the National Register of Historic Places, making them a National Historic Landmark and a State of California Historic Park. Andy Warhol shot scenes at the towers for his 1964 film, Tarzan and Jane Regained, Sort of, featuring a young Dennis Hopper who would return to the towers for his own 1988 film's Colors, but only to blow them up. Then there is the celebrity status that Simon Rodia, the creator, has earned for himself. Here, he is featured on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, just behind Robert Zimmerman, another piece of work that has gotten a name change. Bob Dylan there. But perhaps the most famous visitors to the towers yet have to be the Simpsons. The monument they are all interacting with, however, is only an anglicized version called the Watts Towers. But the actual monument, as first created, is Nuestro Pueblo. It is this name that is awkwardly carved on the outside of the main gate, in the walls, in the inside, and repeated 4 or more times on the tallest tower, making this the structure's original name, given to it by its creator and subsequently changed. There is a level of irony in the fact that the structure's original name translates into our community, since this monument has not belonged to the Mexican community for a long time. It, like the land it rests on and the whole Southwest of the United States, was purloined from Mexico and the indigenous people before that. The preliminary archival, genealogical, and ethnographic research I have conducted thus far indicates that this monument's factual name was changed by the committee of Simon Rodia's Towers in Watts in the late 1950s or 60s. This exclusive group of outsiders, none of whom were Black or Latino, came to Watts to save the towers. They described themselves as, quote, a small group of artists and architects who mortgaged cars and homes to save Rodilla's masterpiece from demolition by the city of Los Angeles, unquote. They protected the towers by establishing visiting hours and creating regulations to, quote, preserve the internationally famous work of art, unquote. Along with the CSRTW, the official historiography of the monument has also been shaped by 2 monographs and an edited collection of essays focusing on various aspects of the monument's historiography, construction, and aesthetic signification. These texts are 1989's The Watts Towers of Los Angeles by Leon Watson, the 1997 The Los Angeles Towers by wife and husband team of Arloa Paquin and Bud Goldstone, and finally, Salvatore Rodilla's Towers in Watts, Art, Migration, Development, edited by Luisa del Gudice. Then there are 2 documentaries, films that feature the artist as the main focus. The 1957 film, The Towers, by William Hale. The 1987 Daniel and the Towers, directed by Paul Schneider, starring the late, great Carmen Zapata. And the 2006 I Build the Tower, a feature-length documentary directed by Edward Landler and Brad Bayer. The only problem with this historiography is that very little of it is based on historical and verifiable facts and events. Here is an excerpt from the historical data section of a 1983 preservation plan prepared for the state of California's Department of Recreations and Parks by the Ernstkrantz Group in collaboration with the CSRTW. This section articulates just how unsound the current research on Nuestro Pueblo is. And it says, quote, the mass of conflicting information makes constructing an accurate, objective history of the towers quite difficult. Although vast quantities of written material on the towers exist, much repeats initial accounts and reinterprets partial evidence with no concern for primary sources or documentation. Press coverage typically focuses on the controversy and politics surrounding the towers and seems to prefer colorful anecdote to hard fact. Footnotes have been provided as a means of discussing the discrepancies surrounding this data. The fact that these notes are more extensive than the text is the clearest indication of the predominance of supposition and rumor over truth where the history of the Watts Towers is concerned, unquote. So the troubling issue with this is not the initial flaws committed by the early members of the CSRTW, but the fact that their malinformed narratives have been subsequently aped by scholars. Many people have furnished partial theories attempting to explicate some of the most persistent questions revolving around Nuestro Pueblo. Monica Berra exhibits the sentiment of most Towers scholars that Rodilla acted without intent when she states, quote, the effort of groups over the years to give meaning to the towers is, in many ways, a struggle with greater cultural questions about art without intention, unquote. Scholar Charlene Villaseñor Black provides a much more productive framework when she states, quote, works of art never exist as autonomous signs, but always function within a larger cultural system, unquote. So Rodilla's actions may appear random, unrestricted, and motivated by chance only because of the misinterpretation and or dearth of information on Rodilla and Nuestro Pueblo cultivated by past scholarship. Thus, we must contend that to understand the monument more completely, one must understand that it was never, and is not now, divorced from everything around it. And it does not stand alone, apart from its environment. Instead, It's connected to the place and the people that witnessed its creation. The evidence compiled so far strongly indicates that it was not so much the language barrier that kept the Mexican contributions from the official narrative, but rather that it was what they were saying that directly contradicted the narrative that was being constructed after Rodilla left the towers. For example, of the half dozen people who grew up near the towers in the 1930s, not one agrees with the claim that they were built or even begun in 1921. Naturally, the systematic ignoring and possible covering up of Mexicans and their role in history is not new or limited to this instance. As an example, one can point to the determined absence of references to the earliest published text featuring Rodilla and his towers. The 1940s Nuestro Pueblo, Los Angeles City of Romance, written by Joseph Seaworker and illustrated by Charles H. Owens. This text briefly highlights Rodilla's and the tower's Mexican elements and illustrates Rodilla's fluency in Spanish. The fact that he ran a church out of Nuestro Pueblo and that his congregation held weddings and baptisms in Spanish at the towers is also ignored. As this 1935 flyer for the radio preaching engagement to celebrate Mexican Independence Day shows, Rodilla must have been fluent in Spanish if he was preaching on the radio. Both of the commemorative plaques bizarrely omit the structure's real name, as does the 1990 Arloa Paquin Goldstone's application on behalf of the Department of Cultural Affairs to the National Park Services, where she asserts that, quote, the towers of Simon Rodilla, unquote, was Nuestro Pueblo's historic name. More recently and baffling, in 2014, when the aforementioned Salvatore Rodilla's Towers in Watts, Arts, Migration, and Development was published, it had nearly 20 separate scholarly essays, yet did not include one single essay dedicated to Mexican elements of Nuestro Pueblo. The editor of the book does state that, quote, the full extent of Rodilla's links to the Mexican culture remain largely unexplored, unquote. Until now, that is. Other under-researched elements include reports and accounts of Rodilla attacking people or getting into physical altercations. And so his pattern of violent behavior is seldom discussed to the extent necessary to archive a more complete understanding of his psyche. For example, his behavior during the time in Watts ranges from eccentric. He buried an entire car next to the towers. And he also kept a soap collection, though he was famous for never bathing and only rubbing alcohol to stay clean. Then there was his violent behavior, like when two Long Beach neighbors laughingly told a story during a recorded interview about Rodilla pushing a black man to the ground, pulling a knife out on him, and threatening him for sport. The published transcript of this interview in Salvatore Rodilla's Towers in Watts omits the story. There's also the fact that in 1921, the year Rodilla is said to have started Nuestro Pueblo, he was living in Long Beach, where he built a concrete merry-go-round and other structures. The 1921 and 1924 city directory lists him as residing in 1117 Euclid Boulevard, while the Watts directory lists Lino and Josefina Gonzalez as Watts property's only residents. Property records show that the Gonzalezes did not sell the property to Rodilla until 1929. And finally, the most conclusive evidence that the towers were not and could not have been built till 1932 at the earliest comes from Medina Morales's unearthing of aerial photos taken by the United States Geological Survey that show no evidence of the towers till after 1932. And it's a little hard to see, but this is the house, this is a shed, and these are trees. but no towers. Returning to Rodia's Long Beach days, there is this local paper that ran a story titled, one, quote, "One turns on gas, other leaps from Pine Avenue Pier," unquote, where Rodia's wife, Benita Rodia, attempted suicide after being, quote, "reprimanded," unquote. It is unavoidable to assert that the circumstances of a husband reprimanding his wife in 1922 likely involved domestic violence. In this particular case, the reprimand was severe enough to be reported as the cause of Benita's attempted suicide. Simon Rodia would then file for divorce from Benita, not the other way around, as some scholars have asserted. In court records, Rodia cites Benita's abandonment, physical, verbal, and mental abuse as the reason for his divorce. The documentation Rodia provided to support these claims, nonetheless, seems to be contradictory in places. For example, of the 3 documented alleged signed documents by Benita, none of the signatures match each other. And in the case of a supposed letter that she typed, Benita's signature bears a pronounced resemblance to Rodia's own hand. Then there is Rodia's threats that are recorded on tape, where he clearly and repeatedly threatens to, quote, "cut his neck off," unquote, referring to a priest who allegedly owed him money. Residents of Watts report that Rodia carried a revolver and shot at people on more than one occasion. But perhaps the most outlandish claim made by 2 separate informants is that Rodia built the towers as a tribute to his dead wife. As unusual as this claim may seem, there is increasing amount of physical and archival evidence that corroborates this story. For example, Rodia himself said that he built the towers because his, quote, "his wife died," unquote. Then there's a New Yorker article by Calvin Trilling that recounts how, quote, "some of the people who live in Watts like to believe that the towers are a monument to Rodia's wife," unquote. And then that, quote, "it is occasionally said that she is buried under the tallest tower," unquote. Poet Paul A. Harris calls the towers LA's, quote, "Taj Mahal," unquote, in his poem titled Sam's Ark. This is a pencil sketch on a wallpaper by an artist named Bob DeWitt. And he was a friend and associate of Bill Cartwright, the founding member of the CSRTW that we discussed earlier. In this artwork, we observe a scene constructed to contrast the prostate of the body of a woman here to the rise of the vertical towers, as if they are growing out of her. The 2 white-clad figures and the personified automobile lend this image a sinister tone. In this close-up, it is clear that the woman on the floor is with child from the way that she's cradling her stomach. And the figures, seemingly to be donning Ku Klux Klan garb, are stepping on the woman's pubis and pelvis. Then there are the trowel leaning on the woman's left arm and the hatchet next to the woman. And then finally, there's the 3 men in glasses with unfinished features that give them an ominous look. The car is made to look beastly. It's marked by 2 curious words, official, it's hard to see, across the windshield there, and LA City, which is seen on the license plate. All this begs the question of why city officials would be featured in this disturbing scene. So if the committee did, in fact, wish to wipe out all traces of this woman and Rodia's connection to the Mexican community, how would they go about doing it? Well, First, they would need to erase all memories of the final wife for whom he was said to have built the tower. This is a plan view of the lot where the tower stands. Here we find that from a bird's eye view, the most overarching elements of the lot where Rodilla built Nuestro Pueblo is its silhouette. It is, as many scholars have noted, pointing to the east, which is towards Rodilla's homeland of Italy, his land of birth. With the exception of Rodilla's home, which is number 1, which pre-existed the lot, there are 7 freestanding structures and 5 installations supported by or attached to the wall. The only element that I wish for you to call your attention to, however, is the appropriately numbered 13. If Rodilla had buried his wife in the towers, what would her resting place look like from above? What would it look like from ground level? Maybe akin to a sarcophagus? As we concentrate our attention on the lot's internal arrangement, a pronounced change into a smoother, rounder, circular motif becomes evident. Of the rounded components, many are or were, when first constructed, associated with water. There are many references to baptismal fonts, bird baths, and turtle ponds. Many of these have been covered over after Rodilla left, but there are still some of the structures that have pipes and or hose spigots still visible. Going to a close up look of the front entrance, one notes a curious anomaly just under the heart and above the address. The tile displays the initial CR in dark blue tiles surrounded by light blue tiles, but for one strategically placed ochre tile that upsets the chromatic unity of that part of the mosaic. Shifting attention to a close-up of Nuestro Pueblo inside details, we again see initials emblazoned into the towers, where some odd characteristics surrounding these details exist. Take the bottom left photo and concentrate on the first letter. According to previous consensus, this letter is an S. However, if we were to swivel the 2 bottom tiles to the right, would it not be a C? Then there's the top left photo that shows a single light colored tile hanging off, almost hanging off of there, that the first letter that also seems out of place. That's because it likely is. Turn your attention to the bottom right photo of the number 9. It's missing a tile. Now compare the hue of the tiles on the number 9 with the hue of the aforementioned tile on the letter S in the top left. Could this not indicate a creative rearrangement of the original? And if so, what other purpose than to erase the connection to the Mexican woman who inspired the towers? Remember, her name was Carmen. Finally, the top right photo where concrete has been piled atop the tiled letter that appears to be a C. It is highly unlikely that Rodilla, whose artisanship was evident throughout the monument, would have played a part in any of these incongruities. Is a reasonable person not justified in wondering what this transforming of the C's into S's could possibly mean? Oops. In closing, it is important to note that our collective embracing of inconsistent narratives about this monument only has facticity in the sense that, and to the extent that, key scholarship is left to be done. When we address the significant documentation and critical information related to Nuestro Pueblo, we will be able to postulate not a new, but a reasserted signification for this monument. It is a productive goal work towards a more clear and consistent identity for Nuestro Pueblo, and to hope that in time, it is conclusively shown that when it comes to the towers of Watts, Mexicans were not there. Thank you very much. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So there's a mic there as well. Up to hear from you all.
All right. Questions. Thank you, first of all. That was incredible. I didn't know any of that. And fascinating. And I have questions of my own, but I can't selfishly hog the I could. I have the mic, so I could just do whatever I want, right? But no, but let's go back over here. Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about the role that your student scholar played in the research?
Oh, definitely. So I'm glad you brought that up, because the project I've been working on for about 8 years now, off and on. And I think that it's fair to say that I can get obsessed with certain aspects of mysteries and narratives. And so, but another thing that happens is that there's a period of not wanting to know anything about that thing that you have been so involved with. And in that moment, having somebody else for whom everything is fresh and new is really a valuable thing to remind you of how important the research is. And for me, that's what Angeles brought to the project. When I was up to here with stuck and not being able to figure it out, there was a fresh voice to ask the questions that I had forgotten. And so that to me really kicked the project into another gear. And like I said, a lot of the really interesting documentation has only recently been unearthed because of the resources that she was able to bring to the project.
Thank you so much, Guillermo, for this wonderful presentation. I just wonder, sometimes it's so difficult to bring the students to these amazing sites. I know, because every time I teach about this Mexican being present and all the Hispanic, tradition that we have here, it costs a lot. Especially we need to pay an insurance to just hire a bus to bring the students anywhere. So all this interest to, I don't know, like probably ask you if it will be step 2, probably create a virtual reality video with the amazing people, the ITAs, John Stroder, everything, James Stroder, and then we can use that amazing virtual video with your knowledge and everything to not only your classes, but to more departments and more classes on campus. Thank you.
Absolutely. The Watts Towers Art Center campus has collaborated with people, and I'm sure they would want to collaborate with us if it was like a educational purpose. So we can absolutely think about that. And then just getting maybe people to go and see the site. It has quite an interesting energy when you visit it. So yes, absolutely. I would love to talk more about that.
And to that point, James Trotter and the team down in the X-Real Lab and everybody, and they're doing great stuff with virtual reality. So I'm sure they would be excited about that project.
No, absolutely.
Any other questions? I mean, I have questions of my own. All right. So here we go. I'm going to ask you one question. I have two. Well, first a comment. I never knew Langston Hughes spoke Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you for.
He was fluent.
Yeah.
He lived in Mexico with his father, who was a millionaire in Torreon, Coahuila. And nobody knows, because we're very invested in making sure Black and brown people don't get along. I mean,
no.
Yeah.
That's a fair point. And so then my question is kind of a little bit related to that.
Yeah.
So Just coincidentally, I've been known to ask long questions. So yesterday I was listening to a podcast, Revisionist History, Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, and he was talking about the Hitler Olympics, the 1936
Oh, yeah.
Olympic in Berlin, and speaking specifically about the story around Jesse Owens and a guy named Luz Long, who was a German broad jumper. Anyway, and there's this fantastic story that has been told for decades about Jesse Owens and Luz Long and their friendship, and how they Long, who got conscripted into the German military, how he would send him letters from the front lines and things like that. And it turns out none of that's true. And so, when you started, you were talking about the narrative around the Watts Towers / Nuestro Pueblo as fascinating but largely untrue. And so my question is, it's kind of a general question of like why you think a false narrative, and maybe it's tied to what you were just saying, but a false narrative like that was spun to begin with. And I understand these things ultimately take on the life of their own. But then also the second part of the question is, do you think that the demographic shifts in Watts over the last, say, 5 decades, where it went from predominantly Black community to a predominantly Latino community, had any impact on the kind of more accurate narrative being kind of unearthed or discovered?
Yeah, so a couple of things. My training at UCLA was very heavily influenced by what they call the postmodern school. And basically that philosophy says there is no official truth. And it always rubbed me the wrong way. And the professors, of course, I wasn't very popular with them because I was trying to articulate my problem. And then I had an epiphany. My problem was not with letting go of ultimate truth. That I realize I can do. What I can't let go of is ultimate falsehoods. And to let go of one means you have to let go of the other. And we've seen what not honoring facts has gotten us. Or it could still get us, a civil war. And so there's consequences for embracing that narrative that facts don't need to support your claims. You just need to make the claims over and over. And so for me, discovering this project, it was that, why was it true that the Mexican influence was nowhere near the towers? Basically because a group of very powerful people decided that it wasn't. And so what I'm doing is everything that I've said to you, I hope you're questioning it, and I hope you email me and I can send you the documents. And so usually it's 1, minimum 2 documents that support any claim that I'm making, only to protect myself from the same claim that I'm making about other people, which is you just made that up. So the importance of facticity, if not truth, it's embedded in this for me. And that's why it's important, because for too long, we've had this burying of real live people's narratives in service of this great white man myth, which we see in history all throughout. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the
No, and the second part was just about the demographic shifts in Watts, and that did that have any impact on this story being told now?
So I didn't say this in the lecture because I didn't want you to sort of say, okay, now we have to like it. But this is important. The thing I didn't tell you was that I was born and raised in Watts. And my mother, 1970s, the towers were neglected, like falling apart. And my father, at the time, who was a drinker, would get his check, he'd grab a 12-pack with his friends and go inside the towers and start to drink. So my pregnant mother pregnant with me, would go look for him at the towers. And so there's people who probably have known the towers longer than me, but I don't think anybody met the towers earlier than me. I was in utero when I went into the towers. So, okay, so then I grew up in Watts, and my first girlfriend, Marnita Lawrence, happens to be Black. And bringing her home to my mother, who today, I think her real problem was that she was robbing her of her only boy. Not so much that she was Black, but that she was robbing her of her lone, male child. really sensitized me to the attitude in the community of these people who we've always been living with, and yet we're apart in some way. But my generation wasn't that. So I didn't share this antagonism of black and brown antagonism. It just didn't exist for me because the people who I played with were of all colors. I mean, Asians didn't live in Watts, and there were no white kids. The only white people were the police. But other than that, black and Latino, that's who you hung out with. So that's what I brought to the project. I don't bring sort of those preconceived notions of the drug. And then when the killing did start, it was really about gangs, not about race. And the crack epidemic, of course, that we lived through in Watts. So I feel that that's my, and it's not a very popular or very touted perspective that we have more things in common, but it's my reality. That's how I grew up. That's how I lived. But I think the media is very invested in this antagonism and this battle that I certainly didn't live. And I grew up there. Yes. Or yeah, sorry. He has his hand up. He's got a mic, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering about your research. And when you say, for example, about the postmodern,
Yeah.
there is no the ultimate truth,
Yeah.
something like that. I would like to understand that the truth or reason, they are always in theory. I mean, they are always in process.
Yeah.
And they are building and they are responding to many situations. And probably this is the most important point of your research, that you are trying to create a reason for this time, for this moment, in order to understand, hey, we need to unearth a Mexican legacy. What thing is really, really important, no, at the end. But what else? What is the next step? We are creating a reason about it, Watts Towers. We're trying to explain about their importance, their origin, and then?
I'll tell you, the woman who people say left Rodeo, if she was in fact killed and buried in the towers, she's not at rest. And I often think about, and this is more superstition about vibrations and right people resting. I often think that a lot of the problems of Watts come from the generation's refusal to settle past wrongs. And so for me, it really is about having her name next to the plaque for him, because she was the reason, if in fact I'm correct, she was the reason why they were built. She deserves, but you know, she was Latino. People say she stuttered. She's probably undocumented. Who cares about that? She was blonde and blue-eyed. Maybe we need to mobilize. This is 1930s, by the way. So in a real way, there's some feminist, connotations to it. The fact that she was a woman and maybe who cares a little bit, and that she was Latino. So there's a little bit of that. So that's why it's important to me. Yeah, to really, and then who knows what will happen after that? Maybe there'll be a million narratives that have and unsolved mysteries. When I was a kid, Watts led the state in drive-by shootings. So, a lot of them unsolved. And so I feel like when we respect our dead, maybe the living stand up a little bit straighter. I don't know. That's, yeah, absolutely.
So you're probably totally going to see this question coming from me, especially because you talked about the importance of facts and documents to back up the claims that you're trying to substantiate, to create the history and call back the history that has been neglected. I would love for you to expand on the importance of archives and libraries in this type of work.
Oh, absolutely.
And to actually maybe share some of the libraries and archives that you worked with as part of this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So no, absolutely very important. Although I have to tell you, what's that old line about archives? It was the only things you don't find in archives are the things that people don't want you to know. And so it's a gathering archival information. You have to be very sensitive to who was gathering it. And so UCLA owns the papers for the Watts Towers committee. And I went there when I was doing my graduate work, and I went through the whole thing. It took me a year and a half. And it was very interesting to see what they thought was important to keep, including a letter to a very famous, his name is Buckminster Fuller, very famous architect. They were trying to figure out how to get the Watts Towers out of Watts and into the West Side, because they felt like they're a masterpiece, but they're in this Black and Latino neighborhood, riffraff. Let's get it to the West Side. They can be properly protected. So that letter was in there. And so that's what I found there. And then I've also gone to the city archives. I mentioned Angeles going into the geological survey because, you know, photographs of Los Angeles County were taken periodically. So we've done that. And then I've also done the repository of the earliest photos of the Watts Towers lives in an archive called Spaces. And it's shepherded by a scholar, and it was in San Jose when I got it. And then now she's teaching somewhere else in the Midwest. And so now it's there. So those are just some, but you know, as we're championing the archive, I want to highlight that my research depends on the repertoire, on the lived experiences of these people who were never put in the archive. The interviews were all with English-speaking people and people who didn't even know about Watts. They just had something smart to say about architecture, and that's who cornered the market on the narrative of the towers. But when the woman yells out, "He's a murderer," while people are recording and all that, she's just ignored. This is just a crazy front door neighbor woman. And so those were the people that I was trying to record. And I have like half a dozen recorded interviews to support this. Yes, and I have to preserve those and, you know, transcribe those, as you know. Yeah, and so I can't tell you how important, even if the archive is tainted, right, or has a point of view, it is absolutely vital that we know what the official narrative is, so that we can bounce off of that. And so when I started this whole paper with that boring history of the Watts Towers, I hope that you felt like, why does he have 3 dates for the same event over and over? That's because the scholarship has 3 dates for the same event over and over again. So I was trying to highlight just what a casualness marks the research. So archives, very important. And that includes your family photos. If you lived in that neighborhood as a kid, and it doesn't have to be a famous neighborhood like Watts, it can be anywhere. People will want to know what people look like, what they thought, what they cared about. And photos lie less than words.
So we're about to be evicted, apparently. But I can't thank you enough. This was fascinating. I still have more questions. So I might take you up on that offer to email you with,
Totally.
not for source documents, just to have my
Yeah.
curiosities answered. But
Yeah.
but thank you once again for
pleasure.
kicking off the year and with such fascinating talk about something I've seen 100 times and never knew anything about. So once again, thank you, Guillermo.